started in the early 1850s when gold was actually discovered here. And that happened right up on Daisy Creek in the early 1850s. Now, the creek up behind us, Jackson Creek, it was the main gold producing creek for over a decade. And the average miner was making anywhere from $1,300 to $1,500 a day. That was the average miner. And that was like way back when. Think of making that kind of money. Yeah, when it was like, the 1850s and like a steak dinner cost like a quarter,
Right.
I mean, really crazy. So the men that were responsible for the starting the city here. Now, originally the name of the city was Table Rock City because the early travelers that came here, the old pioneers, they'd come to the Rogue River Valley in the late 1840s and in the early 1850s. There were two geographical landmarks: Pilot Rock to the south and Table Rock Mountains to the north. This is before maps or anything like that. So
Yeah.
it's a whole new area. It just broke off from France and became part of the U.S. territory just in a few years earlier in the 1840s. So originally the town was named Table Rock City after the Table Rock Mountains to the north of us. But they soon changed it to Jacksonville in honor of President Andrew Jackson. And by the 1860s, Jacksonville became the largest city between San Francisco and Portland. From 1860 to 1880, it was on the west coast. The major cities were San Francisco, Jacksonville, Portland, and Seattle. And it was that way for some time. Now, a real big thing of the era that was going to be very prosperous for the whole state of Oregon, Washington, and California was the railroad. And the railroad got started up in the northern parts of Oregon and Portland area in the mid-1850s. And for the next 20 years, the railroad was planned to come through the town of Jacksonville, go all the way down in California through San Francisco. However, when the railroad tracks, it took them 20 years to get from the town of Roseburg to the Rogue Valley floor. And when the tracks hit the Rogue Valley floor, they went straight through it and bypassed Jacksonville 4.5 miles east of here. And that's how the little town of Medford started.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Now, by that time in history, the gold had run out. But there was a family here called the Barnum family, and they were related to the P.T. Circus Barnum people. And they had built this whole area up behind us in here, became a big railroad yard, expecting for the main line to come through Jacksonville. When that didn't happen, they ended up building this little shack right here, and this became the Rogue River Valley Railroad Depot. It went into service in 1891, the shortest railroad in U.S. history. And in 1893, their son, John William Barnum, was featured in a railroad magazine as the nation's youngest conductor. He was only 12 years old. And that became a very prosperous thing for Jacksonville for a little while. It was a tourist attraction that lasted for over a decade here. And through here, started having a bad effect on all these old historic buildings. However, they weren't historic buildings at the time. It was just like a ghost town here. No stop signs or anything. So just about the time something needed to be done, the I-5 freeway project started, and it was all big news. And the little town of Jacksonville was going to be dismantled. They were going to take down the buildings on California Street and put a 2-lane highway off of I-5 from Medford to Grants Pass. Now, if that would have happened, we wouldn't be sitting here now, and Jacksonville wouldn't look anything like this. However, that did not happen. There was a school teacher from California. His name was Robbie Collins. He moved to Oregon after World War II in the late 1940s and lived in Grants Pass. And then the big news of the town of Jacksonville going to be dismantled was huge news in the 1950s. So he didn't want that to happen. He wanted to try and preserve the history. So he ended up moving to Jacksonville in 1960 and went to work trying to save the town of Jacksonville. He started by taking some of the old buildings and turning them into historical sites. He started out with a handful of buildings, but by 1966, had several buildings, and in 1966, the U.S. government declared the whole town of Jacksonville the first historic monument town in U.S. history. And that is the reason why you see Jacksonville the way it is today. Since 1966, there's over 100 buildings on that National Registry now. These buildings are protected. It's a historical site. The whole town is a historical site. So with that, we're going to go take a look at some old buildings
Yeah.
and talk about the old pioneers. Okay, so Josh, this motor is going to be pretty loud. Now we're pulling out onto Oregon Street, and if you look to the left, you can see how it goes downhill, and if you look to the right, you see it goes uphill. Well, in the early 1850s, all this lower lying land down here was very muddy. You couldn't do anything with it. You couldn't grow anything, and you couldn't certainly build anything down here. It was way too muddy. The winter here, back in the 1800s, there was always snow in the winter. 2 or 3 feet of snow was normal during the winter here. Now we're coming up on the intersection of Oregon Street and California Street. Today, California Street is like the main street of Jacksonville going through Highway 238 here. But originally, Jacksonville or Table Rock City actually started on the next block up. All those two-story buildings that you see right there originally were wooden structures, and through the 1800s, Jacksonville was completely plagued with fires. There was a major fire that destroyed that whole block right there. And on our right-hand side here, this two-story building, this is called the Orth Building. One of the earliest men here was just a teenager when he arrived here, all the way from Germany. His name was John Orth. And he started out as a miner, he became a cattle rancher, and in 1872, he built this two-story building. He was a master craftsman. When that was completed in 1872, that was considered to be a very modern building for its day. And right here in this four-corner area, this is historic Jacksonville right here. We're getting ready to turn up on the original Main Street of Jacksonville. And as we turn up Main Street, you'll see how it goes up the hill. Well, good reason is because, like I said before, the lower lying land down below there was very muddy. So the businesses started right here on Main Street. On this right-hand corner, this was the very first little market in the Rogue River Valley. It was called the American Adams Sundry Store. It was built in 1855. And Mr. Adams was related to John Quincy Adams. Now, as we come up here on Old Main Street here on the left-hand side here, as things dried out down below, the businesses migrated down to California Street. As that happened, hundreds of Chinese people started migrating to this whole area right here. And this became known as the famous Chinese quarters. By 1860, there was over 3,000 Chinese people living in the Chinese quarters here. But there was a Migrant Act that was passed in the 1870s. Wow. And that ended up running the Chinese people out of the state of Oregon. By the turn of the century, only a handful remained here. Now, on the right-hand side here is Veterans Memorial World War II soldier kneeling down to get a drink of water. That sculpture is called the Universal Infantryman. And that was sculpted by a Russian artist that lived here in the 1990s. Very, very cool. Now, as we go up this street here on the right-hand side, this whole right area here was the original homestead grounds of the famous Peter Britt. Peter Britt his name is still famous in Jackson County, especially in the wine industry and the horticultural industry. Peter Britt, he planted that beautiful magnolia tree that you see right there. And Peter Britt, he came all the way from Switzerland in 1852, showed up here in Jacksonville with a horse, a wagon, some camera equipment, and $5 in his pocket. His love of life was photography, and when he left Switzerland, he left his fiancée behind till he could afford to have her brought out here. And by 1860, he had done pretty well for himself and built a beautiful two-story Victorian home that used to stand right here in the famous Britt Gardens. And it was about, it stood about 20 yards from this fence right here. It burnt down in 1960, and all that's left from that old house, if you look down this walkway, you'll see a rock wall down there about 20 yards out. That's all that's part of the old foundation of the old house. Now that was his botanical gardens. He grew all kinds of exotic plants in the garden. He had an old greenhouse. And one time, after he became pretty wealthy, he went all the way back to France and brought back a root ball from a wine grape bush and mixed it with the pinora type that used to grow wild in the creeks here in this part of Jackson County. And he invented what they call the Tacoma grape, named after Peter Britt. And he had the very first vineyard in the state of Oregon in the 1800s. This world-renowned outdoor amphitheater called Britt Festival Grounds. And this is a world-renowned amphitheater, known for its acoustics. There's no other place in the West that has the wonderful acoustics that happen right here. And this all got started in 1963. A couple men from Portland, they were doing this a study on sound. And they found this stage here, did all kinds of testing. And in 1963, they ended up having a 3-day concert here. And it was pretty huge. At that time in history, this whole thing didn't look like it looks today. It was much different looking. But today, it's all modernized, ADA accessible, and it's a wonderful thing. Now, there's a bit of magic that happens here when the music starts playing at night. And it seats about 2,500 people around there. It's an outdoor amphitheater is what it is. And when the music starts playing and the little town of Jacksonville closes down for the night about 8 o'clock or so, you can hear the music almost from any place in Jacksonville. The music flows down through the streets of Jacksonville. It's a very magical thing that happens every time a concert happens here. Now, if you look up in the garden, you're going to see a statue of Peter Britt. And Peter Britt, like I said before, his love of life was photography. He invented a technology called stereo view, and that happened in the 1880s. Basically, it's like 2D technology in photography, and he invented that.
That's very cool. I'll have to look into that later.
Yes, and he also, for 50 years, he captured the history of Jacksonville, all in photographs. In the 1870s, he took the very first pictures of Crater Lake. Those pictures were used to establish Crater Lake, the National Park Crater Lake, way later in the early 1900s.
That's very cool.
Yes, definitely. Okay, Josh, it's going to be our Disneyland D-ticket ride for the day.
I'd like to become that famous making videos and pictures.
Yeah. Now, over here on the right-hand side, this is Noe and one of the 7 dwarfs. He was a very talented musician. He wrote music, he created music. He wrote the song for Walt Disney, Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf, the Big Bad Wolf? And he used to dress up like the clown. Now, this is before Disneyland started. He would dress up like a clown to entertain children, and he ended up getting his own TV show. Can you take a wild guess what that TV show was? Think of the oldest clown you can think of that had his own TV show way back in like the...
I was so young back then watching some of those black and white ones. Shoot.
1960s, Bozo the Clown.
Bozo?
Bozo the Clown.
Yeah.
That house is known as the Bozo House, and Pinto Man's Cold Lake was the original Bozo the Clown. He created the character of Bozo the Clown, and the rest is history.
Wow.
Now, we entered into the area where all the magic happened in the early 1850s. This whole area right here experienced 2 major gold rushes, one in the early 1850s, and then again in the 1930s. Now, the one in the 1930s happened during the time of Depression time, so there was no work to be had, no money to be made, and but people came back to this area and looking for gold. Sure enough, there was still gold left in the ground. If you look over to the left down there, they mowed it all. Oh, amazing! See how it's all lumpy and bumpy down there?
Yeah.
Those are all tailings from the 1930s gold rush that happened here. Now, under the streets going through this part of Jacksonville, there's all kinds of underground tunnels. This whole area is honeycombed with underground tunnels. And there's a book out there. It's a paperback book called Backyard Gold. And it's a story of a family that lived here during the Depression era, right here in Jacksonville. So let's back up a little bit. When it all started in the early 1850s, these 2 miners, James Fleggage and John Poole, they had a weekly or a yearly ritual that they would do. They'd spend their summers up in the Willamette Valley, And by the late 1840s, the California gold fields were really swinging. And then they would spend the winters down in California working, going from different gold mining camps and bartering and trading and buying and selling, all of that. Well, on one of their trips southward, they stopped at the Indian agent's cabin, Mr. Willow's, over by the Table Rock Mountains. And Mr. Willow's son had been scurrying around these parts here, right on Daisy Creek. See, Daisy Creek used to go right through down to the Civil Gulch here. It doesn't anymore, but it used to way back in the 1800s. And he found some gold. So they told the two miners about it, and they showed them where they had found the gold. So Pluggage and Crew came over here and set up camp right here up on Daisy Creek here. But they didn't have any luck, not one bit of luck. So they decided to pack it up and head into California. So something happened that made them change their mind. They ended up buying all this land here. And of course, just about 4 or 5 years earlier, this all became part of U.S. territory, a break off from France. So the land was very, very cheap. You could buy it for pennies on the dollar. I mean, it was so, they wanted people to come out here. And then finally in 1863, they passed that Land Act where they were bringing people from back east out here, you know. And if over to our left here is the sign, that marker where that all took place. And Daisy Creek used to run right through here and all down that way. So they bought all this land up, and then they went and did something that set the course of history. They went to the Shasta Courier, the local paper, and they put a report in the paper way back on the second, third page that they had found so many ounces of gold for so many days in a row. Well, it was a big fat lie. They never found any gold, but that didn't stop them. No siree. So they went on about their business in California, and when they came back through here in the spring, there was over 100 people here by Daisy Creek, through here, this whole area right here. They were living in lean-tos, makeshift cabins. They were living in tents. There were fur trappers. There were miners. There were merchants here. And even saloon merchants were here. So that's how it all started. And they ended up selling little pieces of land off at a time, little parcels of land with the promise of gold on it. And that's how they became very wealthy. And that's how the city of Table Rock City started. They're the ones that drew up the original plot plans for the town of Table Rock City. Now, on the right-hand side here is the famous Eagle Brewery Saloon. It was established in 1856, and originally it was down at the bottom of a hill. The front part that you see today was added to the original saloon in 1898, and the old saloon is beyond the shrubs there. And it's like a time capsule. It's a very small little structure, but it was famous for its lager beer. For 35 years, they held the title of having the best lager beer in all the Northwest, and that was the Eagle Brewery Saloon.
Is there any way to try some of that still?
Right? Yeah, right.
Today? Yeah.
Now, if you look out the front window, you can see this is the historic shot of Jacksonville. This is historic Jacksonville we're looking at right here. And on the left-hand side here is the original volunteer firefighting station, the Applebaker Fire Hall. And that is the original bell up on the top up there. And if you look in the window, that's a beautiful view. It's the sun hasn't blocked it out yet, but that is a real hand-drawn water pumper. And that old water pumper is still in good working condition after all these years. Now we're going to make a right, go down Main Street, and on this corner lot right here, today this is all part of the Jacksonville Inn Cottages. This is the original site of the original Franco-American Hotel, stage stop, and brothel. And it was operated by a real French man named Madame de Ribon. Now Madame de Ribon, she was only 4.5 foot tall. She was a very shrewd businesswoman. When the Old Stage Road, the original Old Stage Road, was the only road that went down through Phoenix, Talent, Ashland, and then over the Siskiyou Mountain Summit. So in 1854, they put a toll road in at the very top of the summit. And if you were traveling at that time, you would have had to stop in here and spend the night at the Franco-American Hotel, like if you were a businessman going from San Francisco to Seattle or Portland. And she was famous for her table d'hote. It was always the same thing: fresh biscuits and a big steak. But a kitchen fire in the early 1870s destroyed the hotel. The whole block burnt down. Now, in modern times, this particular cottage right over here, this is where President Bush and Mrs. Bush spent the night when they were on their campaign tour. And the Secret Servicemen for the Bush campaign tour, they spent the night in the butcher's house. John Orth built this house in 1880 with his own two hands. Like I said before, he came here as a teenager, he became a miner, then he became a cattle rancher, and then got married and had 9 children. So in 1880, he built this for his family right here on the corner of Main and 3rd. And it is a beautiful, he built it by himself with his own two hands, brick by brick. And if you ever want to see some amazing brickwork, you're welcome to go and check it out. Today, it's a wine tasting room called Promotion, and it's pretty cool. And that is the famous historic Ord House. Here, and on our right-hand side, this little red brick cottage we're coming up to. This is called South Stage Cellars. It's a wine tasting room, and I think it's Valley View Orchard. It's their wine tasting room, one of the big orchards around in southern Oregon. But this is where Robbie Collins lived in 1960 and saved the town of Jacksonville in 1966. He worked out of this little place right here. And after that happened in 66, he started getting letters from other countries in the early 1970s. So in 1975, he left and went to Singapore, left America, never came back to the United States, spent the rest of his life in Singapore. He loved it. And before he passed away in 2011 or 2012, he ended up going to 14 other countries and doing the same thing he did in Jacksonville. He died as a world-renowned historian, school teacher from California, Mr. Robbie Collins. Now, after the Franco-American Hotel burnt down, Madame de Rebon lost her husband. And it was about that time in the mid-1870s that the town brickmaker, his name was George Holt. George Holt had his own brick kiln at the edge of town, and he offered her a deal. And she was a lady that liked deals. He asked her, "Ma'am, if you marry me, I will build you your own beautiful hotel." So they got married in 1877, and he built that 2-story brick building you see across the street there. Now, 3 years later, in 1880, the hotel isn't quite finished, and President Rutherford B. Hayes and General John Sherman were the first guests to spend the night there. It's a wild story. See, President Hayes and his party, they went on a campaign tour. This is after the Civil War, and the tour was called the Campaign to Heal the Nation after the bloody Civil War, Northwest Tour. Well, Jacksonville was an unplanned stop, so they sent riders ahead, and but it wasn't ready. But when Madame de Rebon found out it was President Hayes, man, she made it happen. She got the whole town involved, so when the president did show up, there was a big band to greet him. They spent the night, got up in the morning, and had a meal. Well, before they could get done eating, it's recorded in history that she handed the bill to General John Sherman. It is recorded in history that General John Sherman took a look at the bill and said, and I quote, "Madam, we only wanted to spend the night, not buy the damn place." And that really, really did happen. Now, my favorite story is the Beekman family story. The Beekman family, amazing story. Pioneers that started here. A real pioneer family that started here and ended here in Jacksonville. Crazy story. This little corner lot right over here in the early 1850s was some stables. It was called the Kraft Express Company. They had horses and wagons, and they were taking the gold from here to the assayer's office in California. They had to go bankrupt because they kept getting robbed. So Cornelius Beekman, only 20, 21 years old, bought the horses and stables, started the Beekman Express Company. In 3 years' time, he ran over $40 million worth of gold through the stables. He turned and sold it to Wells Fargo and built and opened up the first bank in Southern Oregon in the late 1850s, right across the street. At that time, that was the second bank in the whole state of Oregon. In between the stables and the bank, he met a young lady named Julia Hoffman. Now, they say that Julia Hoffman was 10 years younger than him, and the only reason why she married him is because he had the best looking horse in all of Jacksonville. So they got married and started having a family. Ben and Carrie, later in life, they had a little daughter named Lydia. Now, Julia's family was the famous Hoffman family. Her dad, William Hoffman, was the very first Presbyterian preacher to come to the Red River Valley in 1854. And they traveled across America on wagon trains. There was a party of 13. They left Covington, Indiana in the spring of 1854. 3.5 months it took them to get to Jacksonville. And Jacksonville was their final destination. Now, her dad, their family actually made a living they were farmers, basically. So when they got here, they were expecting to grow some crops and make a living at doing that. But in 1854, it was still way too muddy here. Um, so that didn't really happen. It was kind of hard on the family for a couple decades. But after about 2.5 decades, the very first Presbyterian church got built, and that is on our left-hand side right here. Now, when it came time to build this church in the late 1870s, Cornelius, Mr. Hodgson's son-in-law, married to his oldest daughter, Julia, he had all the stained glass windows imported from Italy, the bell tower handmade in Europe and shipped out here. And Cornelius supported the Presbyterian church here in Jacksonville, paid the wages of the pastor, and he supported other Presbyterian churches all across America. Cornelius and Julia and the Beekmans became very, very wealthy. And Beekman, Cornelius, he was a banker for like 50 years here. He was actually almost the governor at one point in time. And Cornelius had this house built coming up on the right-hand side. This is called the Beekman House. It was built in 1873. Now, in 1873, they were well off, very well off. They could afford to have any kind of fancy home they wanted, but they chose a very Gothic, simple Gothic home. They're very conservative people. Unfortunately, just before they moved into the house, their youngest daughter, Lydia, at the age of 4 years old, died of the measles. So that hit the family pretty hard. Now, their other two children grew up here, and Ben became a famous attorney and moved off to Portland and spent the rest of his whole life there in Portland. And after 50 years of being a banker in Southern Oregon, right around 1911 and 1912, Cornelius decided to retire. And he was a very old gentleman by the time, with white hair, white beard, very stately looking man. He was highly respected. And he owned, like, all the land that Medford sits on today. He owned most of all that land. So they became very, very wealthy. And that's another reason why the railroad didn't come through here. There was some backroom deals going on with Southern Pacific Railroad that involved Mr. Cornelius Beekman. Very shrewd businessman he was. So after mother died, Carrie, she locked up the house and left everything inside of it. Now, Carrie and her dad, Cornelius, they both sat on the board of regents with the University of Oregon up in Eugene. And so when she passed away, before she passed away in 1930, she donated the property and everything to the university. 30 years later, in the 1960s, the university decided to auction off the house. So here it was, a beautiful sunny day. Daughters of the Pioneer are auctioning off the house. Something happened. Chaos broke out. The auction had to be stopped. When the dust settled, the city of Jacksonville was the owner of the Beekman House. Don't know how that happened, but it's been that way since 1966. And that's a story of a real pioneer family that started and ended right here in Jacksonville. And the original very first schoolhouse was built in the mid-1850s, about 8 miles out of town on this old stage road. This was the one road that went all the way down through Southern Oregon and over the Siskiyou Mountains over the summit into California in the 1800s. That's the original old stage road. It wasn't until the 1870s that the first Jackson County school got built. So we're going to make a left here, and on our right-hand side, you're going to see a big old 2-story building. That is the original Jackson County School. It was built in the 1870s, and originally it was a wooden structure, much like the one that you see today, but built out of wood. Unfortunately, it had burnt down. There was a number of fires that happened at the old schoolhouse, And they kept on rebuilding it, and it kept on burning down. Finally, in 1906, electricity came through Southern Oregon, and when that building was brand new in 1908, it was the most modern building in all of Southern Oregon. It was the first commercial building to have electricity and lights, running water, and plumbing. High school was on the top floor, and elementary on the bottom floor. Now, it's it was the school all the way up until after World War II. By that time in 1944, Medford had outgrown Jacksonville, way outgrown Jacksonville. So they wanted to build schools in closer to Medford than. And so it sat vacant for several years. Now, recently, there was a very popular German food restaurant called Schoolhouse Brewhouse. And if you look across the yard, you're going to see a little red train. That little red train, that is the Jacksonville Cannonball. And that was the little red train that was built right here in Jacksonville for the 12-year-old conductor. That became the tourist attraction that lasted for well over a decade until after the turn of the century. Well, sometime in the 1920s, that little train just kind of faded away and disappeared out of Jacksonville. The old family restaurant, the old Schoolhouse Brewhouse German food family restaurant, they were at a museum in California in the 1980s and found that little train. So they bought it, brought it back here, and there it sits. It's sitting in the original location that it used to run coming back from Medford. Originally, the railroad tracks used to run right through the middle of the old schoolyard right here.
Oh, wow.
So
That's
amazing. You're looking at a bit of real history right there. That really happened here around the turn of the century. And there's been some books written about the things that happened here with the kids up at school and the 12-year-old conductor, little William Barnum, trying to get through here. And he ended up getting stalled out here several times because the kids were greasing up the tracks and just playing tricks on them all the time.
I imagine.
It was kind of wild. Now, around 1915, 1920, one of the very first lawmen was a man by the name of Sheriff Augustus Singler. And coming up on the left-hand side here this is the old sheriff's house. And across the street, that two-story building, that was the original Jackson County Jail. And right next to it was the old courthouse. So this was all the city businesses right here in these 2 blocks right here. Well, Sheriff Singler became the very first lawman to die in the line of duty in the state of Oregon. And the second lawman to die in the line of duty was a jailer here at the old Jackson County Jail. Now, right next door is the old courthouse, and the old courthouse was built in 1878. And the old courthouse was the scene of some pretty famous trials that took place here in the early 1900s. But the one that happened in 1927, that was the one. Right after that courthouse, right after that that hearing, there was a murder trial. Right after that, it closed down mysteriously, never reopened. And that was the Theophilus brothers trial, the story of 3 young men that robbed a train on Siskiyou Mountain Summit. And it became the longest manhunt, lasted 7 years. And if law enforcement in Medford would have never gone to UC Berkeley in 1927, they would have never caught those guys. But as it was, that's what happened. There was a Professor Heinrich giving lectures at UC Berkeley on criminal forensics. That's when criminal forensics began. In fact, it was this case that started the whole criminal forensics thing. And he was responsible for that. And because he discovered who one of the brothers were, they put a bounty on their head. It didn't take very long for all 3 to be lodged in Jackson County Jail, waiting for trial. So at the time in history, it was capital punishment for murder here, capital punishment with death by hanging. So all these reporters came here from South America, Canada, and across the U.S. to cover this trial. It was a huge deal. Well, they ended up getting life in prison. And right after that trial, the courthouse just mysteriously closed down and never reopened. They moved the county seat to Medford, and as they say in Texas, that was that. Now, the very first church in the Rogue River Valley was this little church right here. It was built in 1854, and it was the saloon merchants and the miners that paid the funds to have that church built. It cost $300 in 1854, and that was the very first church in all of the Rogue River Valley. The very first Catholic church in the Rogue River Valley was St. Joseph's, And that's right here on the left-hand side here. And it was one of the original miners, James Pluggage, donated this little piece, this little parcel to the church where they could build their church. And that happened in 1858. The Catholic rectory, it was built in 1861. And then in the 1870s, it became home to the famous Father Xavier Blanchett. Now, he has a very popular name in the state of Oregon, especially in the northern parts of Oregon. But in the 1860s, the people in Jacksonville, when he lived here and these two nuns lived here, people in Jacksonville didn't care for him one bit. But that all changed. In the mid to late 1860s, something happened that changed all of that. Smallpox broke out. So people were dying here because of the disease. Doctors were burning sulfur, trying to kill off the germ in the air. So in the late 60s, Jacksonville was full of smoke. So Father Blanchett, these two nuns, set up a tent up in Kanaka Flats out of the smoke overlooking Jacksonville. And they started rescuing people, taking them up there to nurse them back to health. They saved several people's lives. They never got sick. It was quite the miracle. After that whole ordeal, the people of Jacksonville thought way different about it. Now, the oldest documented residence home in Jacksonville is this little building on the right here. It's called the Matthew G. Kennedy House. It was built in 1855. What's so special about the house? The foundation is flat stacked stone. There's no mortar, there's no cement holding those stones together. It's flat stacked stone. Now, in 1855, now I don't know if this is true or not, but in 1855, there were several Chinese people here already. And Chinese men have an amazing history of building rock walls that could last for centuries. It was just the way that they did it. It was like artwork to them. Now, I don't know if Chinese men built that foundation for that house in 1855, but by golly, I sure would not doubt it.
You're right.
Did.
Yeah.
Just what was happening at the time, and the gold here, and there were several Chinese people that died here because of the miners here. They would work. There were so many Chinese men that needed work, so they would get them working in the mines, and then they wouldn't pay them. And there's terrible stories that happened. I won't even talk about that on the show, but that really happened. Craziness. Now, up in front of us is the original Pioneer Cemetery, Jacksonville Cemetery. It is a real Pioneer Cemetery. It was dedicated in 1860 and still contains some of the original folks that settled Southern Oregon are still buried up there. What's really interesting is after World War II, Chinese representatives came all the way from China here to the Jacksonville Cemetery and exhumed the bones of the Chinese men that had been buried from way back when. They took the bones all the way back to China for their final resting place. And that really happened in 1945. Now, we're going to be coming up to another beautiful house that was built in the same year that the Beekman House was built in 1873. But I want you to compare the two houses, this one here and then the one that we saw earlier, other side of town there. Now, there was something happening in the 1870s. I think it had to do with the railroad, because this house is so darn fancy, and the Beekman House was not very fancy. It was a very simple Gothic home, nothing big to it, And at the time, Mr. and Mrs. Noonan, by the way, this is called the Noonan House. And Mr. and Mrs. Noonan, they have the Noonan Mercantile Store in downtown Jacksonville. And the story is that Mrs. Noonan wanted a beautiful house. Well, you couldn't just pull something like that out of your hat. And the builders here at the time, they weren't building anything like this. They were building like, fancy was like the Beekman House. In the day, that was pretty fancy for that. Well, Mr.
Impressive,
Noonan, Jeremiah Noonan, he had connections, and he found out about an architect living back in Boston, a man by the name of Joseph Barber. Now, Barber was an architect that had was drawing up house plans, And actually, it was about 4 or 5 different variations of this same house. This particular variation is called the souvenir cottage model. So Noonan traveled all the way back to Boston, met up with Mr. Barber, bought the plans, came back out here, gave the plans, had everything in them, everything you needed, right down to the last nail. Handed it to a local builder, and the local builder put it together like a kit house. And it cost Noonan anywhere from $6,500 to $7,200, $7,200 to have this built in 1873. Amazing. It has 5 bedrooms, 5 fireplaces. But what's so cool about it, it's a Barber original. There's only 8 Barber originals in the state of Oregon. This is the only one further south. Now, Barber wasn't famous in the 1870s. Barber didn't get famous till way later, after the turn of the century, in the 1920s and the 1930s. At that time in history, you could buy a house just like that, right out of a catalog. Sometimes that's been called the catalog house, and that's the reason why. But the development of the year 2000, this is called Noonan Square. Named after the historic Noonan House, Noonan Square became a very special project for Jacksonville. This whole area was with the theme of the heyday of Jacksonville. All the houses in Jacksonville were built in Noonan Square were built to mimic the heyday of Jacksonville between 1860 and 1880. All the houses here are mimicking houses built between those in that 2 decade period. Over on the corner over there, that is the replica of the Peter Britt home that burned down in 1960. That's an 1860 Victorian replica. Do we have time to go around the square? Come on, let's go around the square. Right next door to it is a Queen Anne style, and next door to the Queen Anne style is a classic, a classic craftsman. And up in front of us here, this is an exact replica of the Noonan house that sits behind us back up on the hill. And what's amazing, in the late 1990s, it's just a big open field here. And developers actually stood in the Noonan house. In the front window of the Noonan house, there's a half-moon piece of glass. It's called a looking glass. And every Barber home had something special about it. For the Noonan house, it was this looking glass. It was like a telescope. So in the late 1990s, developers actually stood in the living room and they imagined this whole thing. They drew it up, and that's how this became to be. Over here is a classic farmhouse, and this is an Italianate. So those 5 architecture styles, Victorian, Queen Anne, Craftsman, classic farmhouse, and Italianate, those are the 5 main architecture styles that are in the historic buildings, the architecture of the historic buildings in Jacksonville. Such an eclectic mix of architecture. It's just amazing. Now, when Noonan Square went to the building phase, everything was looking pretty good up until that part. But when they went to the building phase, oh man, the whole program got shut down because there were so many code violations. Now, I don't know if they intentionally meant to do this, but they marched right through it. It almost went to court. It was going to be litigated. Well, they found a workaround, and today all these houses are what they call, they're classified as what they call time period correct. And so that's a very special deal. It almost didn't happen here, but, you know, the powers that be, things happened and it worked out. When it came time to build the Noonan Business Center, this was a bit of a different story because of the theme of 5 architectural styles: Queen Anne, Victorian, farmhouse, craftsman, Italianate. Whatever they were going to build here had to represent those 5 styles all rolled up into one building. So they even had like a competition for people drawing plans up. It was a big deal. And finally, they found something that they liked. So when you're looking at these buildings, you're looking at an eclectic mix of those 5 architectural styles in the design of those commercial buildings. Okay, so that's Noonan Square and Table Rock City. It was very dangerous to be outside the town of Table Rock. You generally didn't travel alone outside the town of Table Rock. The indigenous tribes in the Rogue Valley, at that time in history, there was like 5 different tribes. And if they weren't warring with each other, they were trying to keep the settlers out of the Rogue River Valley. In all the research that I did of the news clippings from the 1840s and the 1850s, especially the early 1850s, late 1840s, very, very bad. And there was nothing in there that I could actually share because it was just too bloody and too messy. Wasn't romantic at all. And it was that way until the Army showed up. Now, the whole Indian thing was done away with in just a few years, about 3.5 years. And the Army's job was to keep the settlers away from the Indians and Indians away from the settlers. One of the earliest men here was a man by the name of B.F. Dowell. And he supplied horses to the cavalry or the army. And then after the Indian thing all subsided, he started traveling to Washington, D.C., working to get statehood, for Oregon to become a state. In 1859, when that happened, Oregon became a state. He built this beautiful house on the left-hand side. That's called the B.F. Dowell House. That's a real historic home. Those are marble columns, marble window surrounds. The kitchen on the back was added to the house 35 years later. But that is the B.F. Dowell House. He was the great nephew of Benjamin Franklin, and his one and only daughter, Addie Dowell, she was the very first lady to get licensed and practice law, basically the first lady attorney in the state of Oregon. Now here's a front view of Old Glory, beautiful old courthouse. Shame that it ever had to close down. Now, as we cross C Street, if you look down the middle of C Street, you're going to see some railroad tracks. That's just how the railroad tracks used to run, right down the middle of the street here. They come through the schoolyard, then wrap around behind the courthouse and go right down the middle of C Street. And that was back in the day. And, oh, Josh, I want to encourage you, bud, to look on YouTube for an old Copco video. It's about a 9-10 minute video, black and white, no audio, just video of the DeAngemet brothers trial. You will get a kick out of that. That was the main gold operation right here. And of course, Jackson Creek didn't look anything like it looks today. Back in those days, this is a big, wide creek through here. All these wooden goat booms would have been going every direction here. And at the bottom of the creek would have been these shanty shacks here. And then in the early 1860s, someone brought in hydro mining, and that changed the topography here forever. Then the gold ran out. The next big transformation was the railroad yard. Hard to imagine that all actually happened right here. But right here, right in this area, was a big turnstile to turn a locomotive around. On this side of the street was a loading dock that went all the way down. And there used to be a big warehouse over here where the library's at. And right where this trolley car is parked, this used to be where the big locomotive would park right here. And in front of that old locomotive was the tourist attraction of Jacksonville, the Jacksonville Cannonball. And but as the years rolled on, the decades passed, that all disappeared into history. History is gone forever. The only thing we have left from that whole era is this little old shack on the right-hand side. This is the Rogue River Valley Railroad Depot, and we are back. Alrighty. I know that's a lot of information, bud.
Yeah, it is a lot of information. I can see how you could talk the whole way through it. There's a lot of good, a lot of interesting history in here.
Yeah, it's really real. I mean, all these things really did happen. You know, that's why I love it.